The full list has finally arrived. I'm talking about the big score, the subset of 30 cards that are all flagged as mythic rares that have been randomly inserted into the play boosters at about a 20% chance. The special guest cards share the slot with them, but they're much more rare. You'll get one of these about every 5.5 boosters, play boosters that you open of Outlaws Outlaws of Thunder Junction. I've been covering the saga of this epilogue set that got reduced, chopped down, shuffled into the main set for as long as they've been telling us about it. I found Aftermath a little bit fascinating for its failures and its unusual nature. And we're going to get elbows deep today into not just the cards, but the whys and wherefores of this set. How I think it is better in many ways than what we saw with Aftermath, but where its similarities also lie. So, first things first, 30 mythic rares. Aftermath had 10 mythic rares, 25 rares, and 15 uncommons. And they said in one of the earlier videos, I covered this on the channel, that they had initially planned for this set to be, what were his words, like almost identical. Didn't want to, rehash exactly the same thing in the same way as Aftermath. This leads me to believe that this set was originally 50 cards. This is now my running theory here, is that it was modeled very closely after the way that Aftermath was. So they could have played with the numbers a little bit. Yeah, they could have had 20 rares and 20 uncommons, or they could have kept it exactly the same. But once, the bad news came from corporate that they had to cancel because of how terribly Aftermath had done, that they needed to close up shop and not do the epilogue product, which I know most people are happy that it's dead, whatever. But this means that there's a gap, there's a time in the summer where we're not going to have a product that refreshes standard a little bit. So we're going to have kind of a long slog here, where all of these cards are hitting at the same time, and we're 20 less cards than we would have had before. Now, of these cards, I'm pretty sure they would have kept the original 10 mythic rares. Most of the rest are probably rares that they bumped up to being mythics. There could be one or two that were uncommons originally. Some of the uncommons that they had in Aftermath, like I'm thinking of Filter Out. Filter Out is a strong enough card that if you slapped rare onto it, I don't think anyone would have batted an eye. Or maybe the white creature, Coppercoat Vanguard. There might have been a few people who are like, yeah, this maybe should have been an uncommon, but I think it's also a strong enough card, sees enough play, at least at one time, that also no one would have really quirked an eyebrow too much at it being a rare. So there could have been a few cards like that in this set, the big score, that were originally uncommons that are now mythic rares. How they decided which 30 to include and which 20 to cut, that's some kind of behind-the-scenes process that we may never be privy to. I don't know if they're ever going to open up about all of that. And what does that leave us with here? The set distribution is quite a bit different than it was in Aftermath. And also, this set has a theme running through it. It has an artifact theme, and specifically a token artifact theme that runs through this set. Ties it all together, makes it kind of cohesive a little bit. Whereas Aftermath was nothing like that. Aftermath was a bunch of incredibly disparate, weird, niche build-around cards that had nothing to do with one another, for the most part. There might be a couple of Humans Matters cards over here, one or two things like that play well with Exile that you could play together from Aftermath, like Rocco and Chandra's mom, that kind of thing. There were some cards that maybe played well together, but overall, Aftermath had no cohesiveness. It was just trying to capture all of these different card ideas and all these different stories. It kind of felt like they were a bunch of weird build-arounds for Commander. Um, this set feels tighter. Um, and I still think that if they had released this set, with this artifact theme and this, tighter mechanical theme to it, I feel like this one would have been a much greater success in the market. It also feels like these cards are maybe stronger mechanically. It's not to say Aftermath was all, stinkers, that they were all terrible cards. There were some gems among them, for sure. Cards we play in Standard to this day. And cards that you could play, even though no one is. This one feels more powerful, though, just with the 30 cards we have access to. So I think it was a missed opportunity not to go ahead and publish it. But let's get into the weeds here with what we've actually got access to. I'm switching the cards over to their default view. Just you can see more on the screen that way, and makes it a little bit less confusing in terms of all the different arts. So first I want to talk about the set in broad strokes, then we're going to go over card by card. There are 4 cards in white. There are only 3 cards in blue. There are only 3 cards in black. There are 5 cards in red. The very last one got previewed today. So it's these, this one, and this beautiful gem right here. Green got 5 cards. There are only 2 multicolor cards, and this is an enormous difference compared to Aftermath. One of the defining traits of Aftermath, I feel like, if there can be any such thing, is the multicolor, along with like the legendary creature theme, and that's because of all of the planeswalkers who turned into legendary creatures. This set is totally different. So just 2 multicolor cards here. 6 artifacts. And that is already a big difference between this one and Aftermath. Aftermath just had Karn and Drannith Ruins. Right? It had 1 land, it was Drannith Ruins. It had 1 colorless card, it was Karn. We got 6 colorless cards here. So this change between, the weighting of colorless to multicolor and monocolor is a big difference. And we've got 2 lands. All right, now we're going to compare to Aftermath. And remember, Aftermath has 20 more cards in it. Right, it's 50 cards compared to the 30 that got chopped down to in the big score. So if it seems like some of the numbers are more generous, it has like 66% more cards in it than the big score. So there are 6 white cards, 4 blue cards, 5 black cards, 4 red cards, 6 green cards, and then multicolor. Multicolor in Aftermath weighs in at a whopping 23 cards. 23 cards out of the 50 are multicolor. That's part of the weirdness of the set. If they don't have an existing deck, if they don't have an archetype that they already fit into, then multicolor cards are exciting and powerful and fun. They can also be a little difficult because if you can't cram them in anywhere, then they're hard to cast. There is also the 1 colorless card and the land. Drannith Ruins and Karn Legacy Reforged. So in terms of ratios, the amount of monocolored cards and colorless cards are far more generous in the big score compared to Aftermath. Aftermath expects a lot of you in terms of how far you want to splash, how many colors you want to throw into a deck to use the cards that it offers. Whereas the big score, the cards are much easier to play. They slot into monocolor decks. They're easier to fit into, white plus X, rather than having to be specifically like white-green or white-red-green. So I guess what I'm getting at is this set feels like it's got a better design. It feels more cohesive. It feels more forgiving. It feels more powerful. And it's got a mechanical theme that ties the room together. And frankly, I would have loved to see what the other 20 cards were. And maybe get a chance to get these in their own booster packs, because I feel like they would be cheaper that way than the way that we're going to get them. They're not quite as unattainable as the regular Mythic Rares of the set, although getting an individual copy of a card is actually slightly harder. Right? If you open, 100 or 1,000 play boosters, you'll have a taller stack of big score cards than you will of the regular Mythics. But you'll have more repeats of the regular Mythics because there's 20 regular Mythics in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And there are 30 of these. So you'll have more total cards but less repeats. If that makes any sense. Alright. Now I want to talk about them. I want to go card by card. Get into the weeds. Like I said, we're going elbow deep here. So, Collector's Cage. This has Hideaway. So you get to look at the top 5, put one face down. And this can put +1 counters on creatures you control at instant speed, I might add. Just pay 1 and tap. If you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, which is really easy to do. If you have a creature deck, it is really easy to turn on Coven. And it's especially easy to turn on Coven if you can pay 1 and tap to put a +1 counter on at instant speed. So I feel like turning on Collector's Cage and getting this free card underneath it is going to be really easy, almost trivially easy to do. And I think this card's going to be exceptionally powerful. The only thing that's going to hold it back from just dropping like 9 drops and whatever onto the table is you need to get on the board early, which means you've got to have stuff that costs like 1, 2, and 3 in your deck. You need a bunch of cheap creatures, and you need this Collector's Cage. So the thing you trick out from Hideaway, you could try to shoot for the moon, do like one with the multiverse or Portal to Phyrexia, whatever. But maybe you don't need to go quite that big. Maybe you could just get some fun 4 or 5 drop card that you could have reasonably done as a top end in the deck anyway, but you run a few extra copies because you can hit one for free off of the Hideaway on here. And something that does maybe a team pump effect, have some initial immediate board impact when you actually get the free spell. That could be a lot of fun. So I think just the first card we're looking at here has all kinds of constructed application. Next is Grand Abolisher. I don't want to waste too much time on this. It's a reprint. It's a good reprint. It's a Hate Bear. It's a 2/2 for 2, human cleric. During your turn, your opponents can't cast spells or activate abilities of artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. We have a similar card in Myrel, right, in the soldier deck. But she's 4 mana, and this is 2 white. So if you want to shut off stuff early, like sooner than Myrel could get on the field, then you got Grand Abolisher. Could be pretty good. Just depends on what decks end up making it in the meta. Ultec Matter Weaver. We got a 2/4 for 3, decent body. And whenever you cast a creature spell, which is not hard to do, you can either get another creature, right? A 1/1 gnome. And just that by itself, like, okay, it's already not too embarrassing as a 2/4 for 3. And the very next creature that you play means you've got out 3 power and 5 toughness for just including this in your deck. And if you've got like team pump effects and other stuff for going wide, it's even better than that. So I feel like this card could easily have applications just off of this first mode here. But it can also create a token that's a copy of target artifact token you control. Sky's the limit. There's all kinds of funky artifact tokens, as you're going to see as we go down this list here. So maybe you don't want to just make it a beatdown creature in your, creature deck, making creature tokens, which it's perfectly serviceable at. Maybe you want to do something extra weird with this. And it can serve that role too. So seems like it could be a fun build around that also just has a floor of being a good aggressive creature. Rest in Peace is mostly like a sideboard kind of a card. However, if Best of One gets completely taken over by Nissa and Aftermath Analyst, then people might start just playing Rest in Peace main deck just to hate that deck out of the format, because if it's really the best thing happening and it becomes the majority of the metagame, then people will do what they have to beat it in Best of One. I think this card's a little narrow for Best of One. I would probably prefer something you can use more aggressively. An option there is like Unlicensed Hearse. At least that one crews up later in the game to become like a giant creature. This one feels a little narrow for Best of One. We got some genuine weirdness in blue here. Esoteric Duplicator lives up to its name a bit. It's a 3-mana artifact clue. And when you sacrifice this or another artifact, you may pay 2 colorless. If you do, at the beginning of the next in-step, you create a token that's a copy of that artifact. And now that Ultec Matter Weaver up there, start making additional copies of your token. And this is a clue. You can sack it to draw a card. And if you pay the extra 2, then you can draw a card every turn for 4 mana for the rest of the game, and keep triggering like artifact, ETB, and leaves play triggers, without ever getting into all the other stuff the card could enable. It's definitely a funky build around. It's not got a deck it just drops into, but it seems like it could do some busted stuff. Simulacrum Synthesizer is probably even more powerful. So this one scries 2 when it comes down, which I don't love all of the extra text that go on some of the cards, and that's a bit of criticism of modern Magic design in general, not just the epilogue sets, but the epilogue sets are guilty of it. This card would be much cleaner if it didn't have this scry 2 text, right? Then it would be 6 lines of text instead of 8 on the card. But I digress. Whenever another artifact with mana value 3 or greater ETBs under your control, you get a 0/0 construct artifact creature token that's power and toughness are equal to the number of artifacts you control. And that's pretty amazing. It doesn't say, whenever a non-creature artifact, mana value 3 or greater ETBs. No. You can be playing the prototype creatures, Menace, Lifelink, Ward. You can be playing the Angel, where you choose a keyword at the beginning of combat. You can be playing good artifact creatures in your deck alongside of this card to double up on the board presence. So it's not just these tokens that you're putting out. You can be throwing down all kinds of other power onto the board at the same time. And if the opponent has a sweeper, if it's not farewell, you can just start playing more artifacts, and they'll be quickly in a really problematic situation all over again, because just one of these tokens is going to be gigantic. Worldwalker Helm. Sounds like equipment. It isn't. It's a 3-mana artifact. If you would create one or more artifact tokens, instead you create them plus a map token. That's cool. And you can pay a blue and 1 and tap, create a token. That's a copy of target artifact token you control. Now, I don't know if this one or the Oltec Matter Weaver is easier to use in terms of just copying artifact tokens, but they both do it. They both make copies of artifact tokens. This one requires 2 mana. The Oltec Matter Weaver requires you to have creatures in your deck building construction. So either way you want to go about it, you could start making these giant, people call them Karnstructs, because of Karn. But also this Esoteric Duplicator can just, any artifact that you can sacrifice for any reason. You can pay 2, make a token of it, and now you can make more tokens of it. So coming in at the end of turn step, it might be easier to actually use the Worldwalker Helm, because the Oltec Matter Weaver, it triggers when you play a creature. Unless the creature has flash, you can't do that by the time the end of turn steps come around. But you could activate this. Black has some interesting cards here. So Greed's Gambit. This is a 4-mana enchantment. When it ETBs, you draw 3 cards, gain 6 life, and create 3 2/1 black bat creature tokens with flying. You're like, okay, what's the catch? There's got to be a catch. Well, there definitely is. At the beginning of your end step, you discard a card, lose 2 life, sacrifice a creature. When Greed's Gambit leaves the battlefield, you discard 3 cards, lose 6 life, and sacrifice 3 creatures. The coolest thing I've heard anyone suggest doing with this is donating it to the opponent. And that has got me excited, because I've been trying to think about a way to make a good donate deck in Standard for a good long time. We've had cards already that could donate stuff to the opponent. There just hasn't been a good enough payoff of something that gives you an enormous benefit and then cripples the opponent in exchange. This one might be worth the trouble. So there's the Falcon that just came out in the new set, but we already had a 4-mana black sorcery that can donate something to the opponent, and you draw cards equal to its converted mana cost, which in this case is 4. So if you're keeping track there, between the Greed's Gambit and donating it to the opponent with that spell, you would have drawn 7 cards. Maybe you had to keep this around for one end step, so maybe you had to discard a card in between. But still, that's an amazing amount of card draw. And it puts you up on creatures and life. And then suddenly the opponent's got this big problem on their hands, where they don't want this thing, right? It's going to keep taxing them on every end step, but if they get rid of it, right, if they disenchant it, then it leaves the battlefield, and they deal with the whole leaves the battlefield trigger, which is a problem. So it's probably a bunch of nonsense, but I'm looking forward to trying it. Harvester of Misery is probably a more cleanly playable card. So it's a 5/4 with Menace, and when it ETBs, other creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. So this is a board sweeper. Hits about the same kind of stuff that the one mode on Gix's command hits, like all the little creatures die. This also leaves you with a 5/4 with Menace, and that's pretty good. Yeah, that's big enough to tangle with Shouldered and other stuff in the format. It's a relevant body. So, yeah, wiping the board clear of all the little aggro stuff and then leaving you with a threat the opponent has to deal with. This is nice. This is really good. And you can even channel it, right? You can discard it from your hand to give a creature -2/-2 until end of turn. And in that mode, it can't be countered because it's not a spell. So there's a lot of upside. There's a lot of neat interaction going on with this card. So it's going to see some play. I don't know how much, but it's definitely going to see some play. Then Hostile Investigator. I think this card's better than it looks. We have a 4/3 for 4. When it ETBs, target opponent discards a card, and you're going to investigate. Because whenever one or more players discard one or more cards, investigate. It only triggers once per turn, but it's worth noting it triggers for you and the opponent both. So if you're looting or rummaging, if you're drawing and discarding cards, then that's something that you can do to trigger additional clue tokens. And suddenly, rather than just card selection, you're turning it into card advantage with the clues. So I don't know how much adoption this card sees, but I think it's good enough that if you want to build around it, it'll do good work for you. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. In red, we've got Generous Plunderer. This card actually looks really good. I think people are going to underestimate just how good this card really is. So it's already not an embarrassing body. It's a 2/2 with Menace, and whenever it attacks, it deals damage to the defending player equal to the number of artifacts they control. So it very often in our format is going to be hitting above its power. As soon as it's hitting for 3, it's a good aggressive drop. And if it's hitting for more than 3, then it's pretty amazing at 2 mana. Plus, you get to ensure that you can give the opponent an artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, you can create a treasure token. And when you do, the opponent gets a tapped one. You get to use the mana first. You get to ramp, right? If you played this on 2, then on turn 3, you've got 4 mana. It is not crazy that you could use this in a red-green deck or some other kind of ramp deck, using like treasure and artifacts and other stuff. If you want to go big. But you don't have to. You can just, do like card draw, exile stuff off the top of your library, keep burning through your deck and making extra mana along the way, and that would be fine too. You can just do the aggro game plan, just with more card advantage and more mana generation. And you get to punish your opponent for having artifacts along the way. So I think this guy is potentially worth it for the mana ramp it's giving you and for the artifact synergies that you can create, and how it punishes the opponent for all the little artifact tokens that are running around in Standard. Legion Extruder. This is another card where I don't love the extra text on it. It's not that it's a complicated card, but you could make it even cleaner, right? Like it could cost 1 colorless instead of a red and 1. You just take off the first 2 lines of text here, and you've got a little cheap artifact that just sacks artifacts to make 3/3 golems. You don't have to muck it up with this shock effect, but here we are. We've got this, 2 mana, sorcery speed, shock. When the CTB is 2 to any target. And then you can pay 2 tap, sacrifice another artifact, create a 3/3 colorless golem. Artifact creature token. that part is not at sorcery speed. And that's kind of a big deal. So this can come down, make an immediate board impact by burning something out, and then you can, at instant speed, start recycling any of your little artifact tokens and turning them into 3/3s in the middle of combat, at the end of the opponent's turn. Here's a 3/3 coming in. You know, maybe if you'd like to have blockers, you could take the Phyrexian Mites off of Mirrex and exchange them for 3/3s that can block for you. There's a lot of ways you could use this card. I think, you know, it doesn't necessarily immediately have a home, but it might. You know, maybe the Rakdos Anvil decks would be happy enough to just slot this right in. But maybe there are some other builds you could try to do with this as well. It feels like it could be, you know, it could be mid-rangey, it could be a little bit combo-y, it could play kind of a control game. It's an interesting card. It's not immediately obvious what deck wants it. It feels like multiple decks could want it. Memory Vessel. So they think they've fixed Memory Jar. You know, they thought the same thing about Black Lotus when they made Lion's Eye Diamond, was it? Anyway. Memory Vessel. 2 red, 3 colorless, and then just anytime at sorcery speed, tap and exile it. Each player exiles the top 7 cards of their library. So this can be mill, if that's, you know, that's the least of what it does, but it does do mill. Until your next turn, players can play the cards they exiled this way. So until your next turn means, like, for all of this turn you activated it, all of the opponent's turn, and then as soon as you untap, as soon as it is your next turn, those cards are gone. You have no access to them anymore at that point. But you can play instant speed stuff during the opponent's turn that you get with this. So players can play cards they exiled this way. They can't play cards from their hand, which is interesting. You know, if the opponent has a counterspell or something in their hand that you know that they have, you can deny them access to it for a turn with the Memory Vessel. This is a weird card. It has some corner case stuff that it does. Activate this only as a sorcery. So, to really dive in here, since you're not drawing the cards, right? You're not drawing, you're not discarding, it doesn't trigger stuff like Sheoldred. Probably 3 or 4 cards are going to be land, if we're just being realistic. So, you will make your land drop. That is going to happen. You are going to make your land drop when you activate this card. And then you're going to have some other lands that just end up getting exiled. So is the opponent. How many of the other cards you're able to play depends on how much mana you've set up, how much ramp you have open, you know, how much setup you've done to enable this card before you just, you know, crack it and activate it. All of that being said, seeing 7 new cards and seeing them, you know, potentially at a time of your choosing before the opponent is ready could be interesting. You know, if you have a lot of mana, you know, like some of the ridiculous amounts of mana that these new Nissa decks have been able to make, where you get down the you know, 7 mana green enchantment, your basic start tapping for triple mana and stuff. In that case, you could play the Memory Vessel and just go ahead and crack it and use all the stuff off of it immediately. And the opponent's probably not ready to take advantage of their weird new hand of cards. They might have even been tapped out when you do that. So, There's a lot of ways I could see using this card. You know, I can see using it for a mill strategy. I can see using it for some kind of a combo strategy, for just like go big ramp. It's interesting. I don't know just how powerful it is, because you don't get to use those cards later. They don't, unless you are like casting them and playing them, they don't get to the graveyard or anything. They just get exiled, and that's not really a resource. So the card does feel somewhat fixed in a number of ways, but still I'm curious to see what people can do with this thing. Molten Duplication. This one feels like a little bit of a trap, maybe. I'm not as impressed with this one because it requires setup. It feels like you're already winning the game by the time you've got the thing you want to copy. So I think in older formats, you know, maybe if you're sneak attacking something in, which, again, you might be winning the game anyway. So yeah, I guess maybe you don't need the Molten Duplication for that deck. It's hard to figure out how to engineer the scenario where this is like hitting the sweet spot, where you've tricked something out, maybe even just temporarily, and now you get to make a copy of it. So this one is not my style of card so much, but I could imagine it doing something interesting. Right? So, for instance, it doesn't just copy creatures, it can copy artifacts. So if you paired Molten Duplication with this memory vessel up here, then you could potentially be drawing yourself 7 cards with a Molten Duplication by making a copy of that. Sounds ridiculous. I would think if you've got the memory vessel, you're already doing the thing your deck wants to do, but you could do even more of it. And we've got Territory Forge. This one was previewed just today. And hello, beautiful. So this is a 5-mana artifact in red. When this enters the battlefield, if you cast it, so it doesn't just work by blinking it or whatever, you exile target artifact or land. And it has all activated abilities of the exiled card. This is land destruction, and this is good land destruction. I know 5 mana is a lot to pay, but it's also ramping you. Right? This is an artifact that can come in, exile one of their things. Could be a basic land. Could be a basic land that had ossifications sitting on it. Now you get those things back. And you can tap this thing for mana. Whatever mana that basic land produced, now you got a mana rock. And you killed their planes or whatever. This is a really, really interesting card to me. And you could get multiple use out of it. You have to do it the hard way. You have to bounce it back to your hand, right? Because you need to have cast it. But there are ways to do that in Standard. You know, I've built battle control decks that used Filter Out from Aftermath. And that would work perfectly well here, too. So, feels like land destruction could be back on the menu. You know, not to where you can necessarily destroy every land that the opponent has, but enough that you keep them off kilter. And this one also ramps you at the same time. It can also hit artifacts. So, you know, I just love this for the land destruction and ramp. Love it for that alone. But it can also hit artifacts. And then if that artifact had activated abilities, this has got those. So, and sometimes, you know, you just need to get rid of an artifact. 5's a lot to pay, but if you're going to lose the game to Portal to Phyrexia, then yeah, exile it. This card looks amazing. Ancient Cornucopia. So we've got a mana rock in green. Makes mana of any color. It costs green and 2 colorless. And whenever you cast a spell that's 1 or more colors, you may gain 1 life for each of that spell's colors. Do this only once each turn. So this feels like it could have been an uncommon that got promoted to a mythic rare, but I will say that this could still see play. It is totally reasonable to imagine that you're casting 3 color cards with this. And, if you're going up on mana and you're gaining 3 life once a turn just by playing the game and casting your spells, that's pretty good. It doesn't have to be a spell that you use with the mana from this artifact, right? It just says whenever you cast a spell that's 1 or more colors, you may gain 1 life for each of that spell's colors. You don't even have to sequence it correctly, because if I'm reading this right, since it's a May ability, you can choose not to use it, right, if you play like a monocolor spell first, and then when you play like a 3-color spell as a follow-up, then you can choose to go ahead and do it, and that's the once per turn that you get to do it. And you don't have to use the mana from this thing to gain the life. Obviously, life gain decks would have more synergy for using this, and that might be where it goes. But I could also see like ramp or control decks that want a little bit more of a cushion for going later into the game, to just include something that gets you up on mana and also stalls. Just gains you life and stalls the game. Even gaining like 1 life per spell, you can see from Celestis how just gaining 1 life here and there adds up a lot. Can put you out of range of burn. And this one only triggers once a turn, but A, it could trigger on the opponent's turn. So, you can be doing double duty here. B, it can be gaining a lot more than 1 life. 1 life is kind of like the floor on this card. As long as you're not just casting colorless things, you're going to have the opportunity to gain life. And, in a 3, 4, 5 color deck, could be a lot of life. Bristlebud Farmer. So we've got a 5/5 Trampler for 4. It's a pretty good body. When it ETBs, you get 2 food tokens. So could be artifact synergies, could be life gain synergies. And on top of all of that, when this attacks, you can sacrifice a food. If you do, you mill 3 cards, and you can put a permanent card from among them into your hand. So artifact synergies, life gain synergies, graveyard synergies, card advantage, 5/5 Trampler for 4. Anyone who tells you this card is unplayable is just wrong. They do not know what they're talking about. Go out and play this card. Omen Path Journey. So this is a 4-mana enchantment, and I have to admit I'm a little bit of a sucker for green enchantments that mess with land, so I'm going to like this card. It says when it ETBs, you search your library for up to 5 lands that have different names, exile them, and shuffle. And I'd like to point out that it's up to 5. This is going to be important in a second. At the beginning of your end step, choose a card at random, exiled with Omen Path Journey, and put it on the battlefield tapped. There's a secret, sneaky, hidden mode on this card if you weren't thinking about it, which is the mode where you play this for 4, you look for 1 land, just 1, out of your deck. And then you randomly put that 1 land onto the battlefield tapped at the end of turn. So this can be a 4-mana ramp spell for any land in your deck. Because if you just pick 1 land instead of like 2 to 5, then you're always going to get that land. I thought that was worth pointing out. So for anyone who says, oh, you can't guarantee what you're going to hit, actually you can. This absolutely can guarantee what you're going to hit and ramp you at the same time with a non-basic. It can do all of that. But I like it just for, like thinning your deck. That's 5 less lands you have in your deck, and as long as the opponent doesn't get rid of this enchantment, they're eventually going to make their way onto the battlefield. And they can be a bunch of non-basics that have a bunch of, neat utility. It could be, a copy of Murex to make token creatures. It could be like, Vengevine Stalker, whatever it is, the green-blue like creature land, or the green-black creature land that makes food and exiles cards. You could get something that draws you cards when you sacrifice it. You could get something that does a discover when you sacrifice it. There's a lot of utility and card advantage. Slow card advantage, but card advantage nonetheless, baked into this thing. And it puts them straight onto the battlefield for this one-time investment. And they can all be non-basics, and that can be a lot of interesting effects. So I think this card is good. I think it's worth experimenting with. And because of that sneaky first mode that I mentioned, it can even tutor exactly the land you want and ramp it that turn. So I think this card is much better than everyone has thought. Sandstorm Salvager. We've got a 1/1 for 3 that makes a 3/3 golem at the same time. So it puts out 4 power and toughness worth of stats for 3 mana. So if you want to do like a stompy deck, right, then there's like a 4/4 trampler that proliferates with Toxic. It's also a pretty good 3-drop that's like 4 power and toughness worth of stats. But this is another one. Green has a lot of 3/4s for 3. It doesn't have a lot of things that are 4 power and toughness worth of stuff for 3. There's a few, but this is noteworthy because it's one of them and it's not a legend. And this also can pay 2 and tap and put a +1 counter on each creature token you control, and they gain trample until end of turn. So this has got a baked-in way to keep growing your board. If nothing else, at least the token it came in with. If you have other copies of this in your deck, then the tokens they came in with. This card seems like it could be really good. I know it's kind of straightforward. It's not some of the funky combo kind of cards we've been looking at, but I think this card could just beat down and call it a day. And Vaultborn Tyrant, this thing, I really like the look of this thing here. So we've got a 7 mana 6/6 with trample. Whenever it or another creature with power 4 or greater ETBs under your control, you gain 3 life and draw a card. And that is not bad just in and of itself, right? It's already replacing itself, gaining you some life, helping to offset the tempo of coming up to the 7-drop. It's got the long-term threat of additional things with power 4 or greater are going to keep accelerating you out of range of where the opponent can deal with you anymore. And then if the opponent kills this thing, then if it's not a token, you create a token that's a copy of it, except it's an artifact. So this card doesn't just represent, 3 life in a card. It doesn't just represent the future opportunity of, more gain 3 life, draw a card by playing more creatures. It also represents 2 6/6s, 6 life, and 2 cards, because of the token that gets generated when it dies. The opponent has to exile it in order to avoid that fate. Now they might be able to, but they might have already had to use a Sunfall by the point in the game that you get this Vaultborn Tyrant. And even if they do cast a Sunfall, the floor on the card is so good because you gained 3 life and drew a card, it already replaced itself. So in that regard, you're not even down a card. It's just there's so much wild upside on this. And could be so much inevitability. If your opponent is not ready to exile this thing, this could just be a game ender. It could be the engine that they cannot deal with. And I think this is pretty amazingly good. If it had reach, it would be unbeatable. It would be unfair if it had reach. All right, we've just got 2 multicolored cards. This is such an enormous difference from where Aftermath was, with its 23 multicolored cards. So we've got loot, the key to everything. So there's been a little bit of backlash online about the design of this character. People saying, you know, this is like trying to grab towards being like a Digimon or a Pokemon or Baby Yoda from The Mandalorian, blah de blah de blah. Maybe. I will say that if this is trying to be a baby Fomori, it doesn't look anything like a Fomori, but I don't think it is. I think if it was a baby Fomori, it would look like a Fomori, and it would have Giant as one of its creature types. So I think the Fomori captured a member of some other race here. Right? It says noble, so I'm guessing it's like the prince or king or queen or whatever of its race. I think the Fomori captured this thing and were intent on using it, or trying to seal it away because it's dangerous. And it's not a Fomori at all. Anyway. It is a 1/2 for green, blue, red. It has Ward 1. So far it's reminding me a little bit of Rafine, where it takes 3 different colored pips to cast it. It has Ward 1. It's a little bit easier to kill than Rafine. They both die to a cut down, but this one dies to shock, or play with fire. Rafine doesn't do that. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of card types among other non-land permanents you control. You may play those cards this turn. So, I guess the idea here is you play like a Voldaren Epicure or something on turn 1 or 2. Get down like, you know, a creature and an artifact, and then you get loot, and loot's going to show you an extra 2 cards every turn. Up until you get another card type in play, like an enchantment, or a planeswalker, maybe even a battle. And you don't have to go all the way in. I don't think it's necessary to have to see like 5 fresh cards every turn. You might just end up milling yourself to death if you do that. I think seeing an extra 2 cards every turn is pretty doggone good. So how far you need to go with this is it's up to you. Is this card good enough to see play? Well, it's the body's pretty small for the mana cost, I gotta say. I know it's a baby, and that makes sense with the lore and all of that, but still. This could maybe block a 1/1 token for you out of like Boros tokens or something, if they haven't like, you know, got one of their power pumpers out yet. But otherwise, there's not much that this blocks. It's not much of a presence on the battlefield. So this is mostly just a card draw engine piece that's a little bit sticky because it has Ward 1. And that's about it. Is that good enough? Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to tell. Could be more of a commander card. It seems like it would definitely be a little bit easier to build around for a commander kind of game plan. But I don't think it's impossible that it could do something in Constructed. Just, again, I feel like it's a little bit small as a creature for being a 3-drop. We have seen, though, that there are some things where the inevitability or the amount of card advantage or power that something gives you, if it sticks, can be outrageous, and who knows? Maybe this will be the same way. Maybe if the opponent doesn't deal with it, it's just a crazy engine that wins the game. We'll see. Pest Control. White and a black sorcery. Destroy all non-land permanents with mana value 1 or less. On top of that, it's got cycling. That feels a little generous, to be honest. I feel like this card's good enough that it would already be a sideboard kind of card. With the cycling, it feels like it's not even a sideboard card anymore. It feels like it's just a main deck card. Because you can cycle it for 2. Cycling for 2's pretty cheap. That's a pretty low opportunity cost for running this in your deck. Right, if you have access to these colors of mana, playing this in the early part of the game probably means you don't die to Boros tokens. Probably means you get to set up, go later in the game, and do your thing. And if you don't need it early in the game, that probably means you're not under that much pressure and you are able to cycle it. If you're not up against, aggro decks with a lot of 1-drops. I guess the sweet spot where someone could really punish you for running this card is if it's an aggro deck with a lot of 2-drops. Specifically. The Lost Jit. Is it Jite? I don't actually know how it's pronounced. Yeah, I always just called it Umezawa's Jit. Back in the day. I could have been wrong all these years. Maybe it is Jite. Someone let me know in the comments. I guess I could just go look it up.
Jite. Jite.
Alright, never mind. I was curious. I actually went and looked it up. Jite. That is how it's pronounced. So, Lost Jite. This thing's powerful. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It's 1 mana, 1 to equip. So, right off the bat, if it's not as powerful as Umezawa's Jite, it's also half the cost. Half the cost to play it, half the cost to equip it. Whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage, it gets a charge counter. That's not when it hits the opponent, right? It doesn't have to connect with a battle or a planeswalker or an opponent. As long as it connects with anything, it gets the charge counter. And that goes on the equipment, not the creature. So the creature can die, the creature can get bounced. If the Jite is still here, it's going to be here with all the counters that it's accrued. And it's got the activated ability of remove a charge counter. Choose one. Untap target land. That could be bonkers. I know I'm mostly talking about best of 1 standard, but in older formats, this could be untapping things like Lotus Fields and lands that tap for 2 colorless and stuff. It could be a big deal. And we even have a land in this set that can tap for more than 1 mana. We'll get to that in a minute. Just this mode on the card is sneaky and could be a very big deal. Target creature can't block this turn. Straightforward. You know, that's just your kind of aggro game plan. And could be useful for getting in to hit like planeswalkers, you know, get past a token creature, get to your battle to flip it, stuff like that. It's just good mode. You know, it doesn't come up all the time. It comes up often enough. And put a +1 counter on equipped creature. So you can just cash in the charge counters on this to buff up the creature that it's on. And you can do this, all of these, at instant speed. Other than equipping it. Moving it to a new creature is sorcery speed on your turn. And I think the craziest one of these is untapping a land. Every charge counter that's on this thing, the opponent has to respect the fact that you have that much mana available. So if they're trying to determine whether you have a counterspell, or whether you have a combat trick, whether you could make your creature hexproof, cast a snakeskin veil, anything like that. Anything at all. If there is a charge counter on this thing, you can untap a land and you can cast that spell. And if you have multiple charge counters on this thing, you can untap 2 lands and cast Negate. It's sneaky because if the opponent's not paying attention, if they're not, aware of how the card works and they're not thinking about it, they're not respecting that untapped mana the way that they should. So I think this card, just for how cheap it is to get it going, and for how much it turns everything on, how easily it builds charge counters, right? If anyone remembers, I'll give you a recent example. In Crimson Vow draft format, there's a Ceremonial Knife. I think that's what it's called. 1 mana piece of equipment equips for 2. And that one gives +1/+0. Whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage, you get a blood token. And some people weren't aware of this at first when they were feeling out the format, but at some point people realized that that thing produces blood tokens whenever any combat damage happens, not if it gets through unblocked or whatever. And that thing was amazing in draft. That was such an underrated card. Getting all those blood tokens, running around everywhere for free, you could generate enough card selection and value that if you weren't careful, you could deck yourself because of all of the blood tokens you could generate off of the Ceremonial Knife. And that kind of power of doing something when it connects just for combat damage is even more so, much more powerful in this case with the Lost Jite. I think I've said enough at this point. The card is going to see play. Lotus Ring. This one might not. It's got cool art. It's got a cool theme. Call back to Black Lotus. So 3 colorless, artifact equipment, equips for 3. That's a lot. There are ways to make it cheaper. You can reanimate it from the graveyard straight onto a creature, etc. But the equipment itself is indestructible. You give the equipped creature +3/+3 in vigilance. That ain't nothing, I will say. Until we get the Wandering Emperor to rotate out of the format, vigilance is still a big deal. And I think vigilance, to some extent, is still a big deal in how it changes up the damage race, how it gives you a presence on the battlefield. So even without the Wandering Emperor around, vigilance is a good keyword. +3/+3 ain't nothing either. And the creature also gains tap, sacrifice the creature, add 3 mana of any one color. So there are some ways you could try to turn this into a combo piece. I feel like we're not going to do that in Standard. I feel like that's going to be something people try in older formats. Maybe in Commander, maybe in like Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, Vintage. I feel like this sees sparing to no play in Standard. I could be wrong. Once you slap this thing on, it can give you like a burst of mana the next turn. And that could be good enough. But for the most part, people haven't been playing a lot of equipment like this in Standard for a while, unless they've got a real specific use for it. We'll see. At the moment, I feel like Lost Jite is the real deal, and Lotus Ring is more for show. We'll see how it shakes out. Nexus of Becoming, I like this one. 6 mana artifact. At the beginning of combat on your turn, draw a card. So the opponent's got a pretty small window of time to blow this up before it does something. So it's pretty easy to get this to trigger. It doesn't just draw you a card. Then you can exile an artifact or creature card from your hand and create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 3/3 golem. Now that could mean that the creature is the same size or smaller, but if it's a good, powerful creature, getting the mana discount on it's probably worthwhile anyway, right? Like, let's say you've got Nexus of Becoming, and you make a Titan of Industry. Now, a 3/3 golem is, obviously not as good as a 7/7 with Trample and Reach. But it still does all of the ETB trigger. Right? You can still make a 4/4, you can still blow up an artifact or enchantment, or get a shield counter, or gain life. So, I think most people would agree that it's worth it to shrink the body in that case to get a discount of 7 mana on your Titan of Industry. You have the setup cost of playing the Nexus of Becoming, but if the opponent doesn't deal with this thing, it's going to keep drawing you cards and keep putting out stuff for free. And really, the opponent can't let that happen. You'll probably get this to trigger the first turn you do it. And that could be enough value in and of itself. But if it gets back around to you, and the opponent still hasn't dealt with the Nexus of Becoming, that's probably game. The opponent probably can't come back from that. I guess you could whiff and draw a bunch of lands and things that you can't turn into golems. You could get unlucky, but I feel like most of the time this card's just going to quickly dominate the game and get out of hand. Sword of Wealth and Power. I won't lie, it's got beautiful art. The other art has got like the freaky spikes or teeth or whatever that are growing out of the vault around it. Makes me wonder if it's kind of foreshadowing Duskmourn. It's one of the only pieces of art that I've seen that I feel like is really foreshadowing Duskmourn. Maybe I'm not paying enough attention. There could be some other art placed around, but just keep that one in mind. Anyway, so this sword, they're always 3 mana, 2 to equip. Gives +2/+2 and protection from instants and sorceries. That's cool. It doesn't get you through unblocked, right? You don't have protection from any of the qualities of a creature. But it does mean the opponent's going to have a really hard time removing your creature. Because most of their spells that remove it or target it are going to be instants and sorceries. So, whenever this deals combat damage to a player, you get a treasure token. So you get some of your mana back, and then when you next cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn, you copy it. Choose new targets for the copy. So there's a lot of deck building considerations there. It wants you to have creatures to wear the sword. It wants you to have instants and sorceries to copy with the sword, but it's still a pretty cool card. Could find a home somewhere in Standard. It's just there's some real deck building costs and to how you construct the deck that wants this sword. So bear that in mind before you just run out and craft 4 copies on Arena. Torpor Orb. This is a reprint, 2 mana artifact. Creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. That doesn't just shut off the ETB triggers of the creatures, it also shuts off, if you had an enchantment that cared about creatures entering the battlefield, or an artifact, or a land, or whatever. Just creatures entering the battlefield do not cause any abilities to trigger. So this is part of a prison style of deck. Obviously, you can break the symmetry of a card like this by being aware that it's in your deck and making sure that it's not going to trip you up because you don't play things that care about creatures and ETB. Maybe you don't have creatures at all. Maybe you're a control deck. Anyway, so Torpor Orb's probably more of a sideboard card, But I could see a case where maybe there's an artifact synergy deck or something in Standard where you could main deck this as just random hate that could even go into best of one. And it could trip up somebody something fierce. You know? Like you might not think this would matter that much, but if you go first and you get this torpor orb down, you could turn off a lot of triggers from creatures in like Boros tokens. Now Boros tokens might be able to get ahead of you and get some things out before you play the torpor orb, but those kind of examples just get worse as you look at aggro decks and then like mid-range decks. Mid-range decks probably hate this thing and want to destroy it, get it off the field. Because there are just a ton of creatures that mid-range plays that care about ETB triggers. So, yeah, this could definitely play a role somewhere in Standard. Transmutation Font. This one is fun. I feel like it's less powerful than some of the other cards we've seen, but I still like it. It's a 5-mana artifact. You can tap to create your choice of a blood token, a clue token, or a food token. That's fun. Of those, I would say usually the clue token's the most powerful because you want to draw cards. The blood token is usually just worse than the clue token unless mana's at a premium and all you need to do is dig. Or for some reason you want to discard. Like you want to get things into the graveyard to reanimate. And then food token is a nice option as well, if what you really need is to gain a little bit of life. And then the fun part on the card, I mean, I love the tap to just make a token. That's already kind of fun to me. You can pay 3 tap, sacrifice 3 artifact tokens with different names, which obviously this card makes artifact tokens with 3 different names. But you could enable this to where it could be available the moment you play it. So you have 8 mana, you have 3 different artifact tokens. You just pay 3 and tap this thing and sack those and just go ahead and do it. And you search your library for an artifact card, put it on the battlefield, and shuffle. Only as a sorcery. So I guess the biggest, meanest artifact in Standard's probably like Portal to Phyrexia. Make the opponent sack 3 things, start reanimating stuff from the graveyard. That'd be a good option, but it's not the only option. There are some other big, nasty artifacts that you could pull out as well. Overall, I feel like this is more of a fun card. This is like maybe a little bit more casual. Don't count it out, though. It generates value. It generates artifact tokens. It draws you cards. It can fetch things out of your deck. You can never count a card like that out of the picture completely. There could always be the deck that wants it for just the right combo. And finally, we get to end on 2 lands. And I'm not even sure which of these is the more powerful. They both look really good. We have Fomori Vault, which I guess this land actually like represents the whole set, sort of. You know, you're like, as a planeswalker in Magic, when you're like channeling mana, you create a connection to the land, right? It's like someplace you've been in your planeswalker journey, and you reach out and make it form a connection to it and channel mana from it. This is actually channeling mana from the freaking big score. This is like the vault that got opened. So that's intense. Taps for colorless. You can also pay 3, tap, discard a card, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of artifacts you control. Put one of those cards into your hand, the rest go on the bottom in a random order. I would like to point out that if you have a single artifact in play, like a blood token or whatever, you can always use this land pay 3 and tap and rummage, right? Discard a card, draw a card. If you have just one artifact in play, then you can cycle. You can cycle your cards. The moment you have 2 or more artifacts in play, you're getting like free scries. You know, you're starting to go multiple cards deep. You're really seeing a lot of your library with each activation. Once you're seeing like 2, 3, 4 cards every time you do this. And it doesn't just become like using a blood token anymore, not just a rummage at that point. Suddenly it's becoming more akin to a tutor. You know, the deeper into your library you get with each look, it's like you're doing an impulse draw or whatever. Just one artifact turns this thing on. I think it's really good. You know, I don't know how many copies a deck runs, but I feel like if you have the ability to make artifact tokens in your deck, or play artifacts in your deck, the opportunity cost of putting a copy of this in is really low. It's not even legendary. So, you know, you could put in a couple of copies, and in a big control deck or a ramp deck, you could potentially activate both of them in one turn cycle, right, with 8 mana. So I think the Fomori Vault is really good, and Tarnation Vista is potentially maybe better. So Tarnation Vista enters the battlefield tapped. When it comes in, you choose a color. I can add 1 mana of the chosen color. So it's already like, you know, kind of like that common desert, where you get to pick your color, comes in tapped, makes mana of that color. As tap lands go, that's fine. You know, that's reasonable. What else does it do? You can pay 1 in tap, and for each color among monocolored permanents you control, add 1 mana of that color. Huh. Now, to go mana positive with this card, you have to have 3 monocolored permanents. Because tapping this land, you already could have made 1 mana by doing that. And you have to pay 1 to activate it. So that's, right, 2 lands, right? 1 to pay the 1, and then this one to tap to activate. So what you really want to be doing is netting 3. 3 or more mana when you get the activation. And if you can do that, then you've got a land that makes extra mana, right? A land that makes 2 or more mana. And those are some of the most expensive cards in the entire game of Magic. You know, some of them have been reprinted a lot in Commander. Maybe they're not worth that much anymore. But there's any number of lands I could name for you that if they make 2 or more mana, they probably are worth something. Even the silly, you know, bounce lands, right? That like returns a land back to its owner's hand and taps for, you know, 2 mana. Even those lands are pretty worthwhile. Pretty good overall. This one is more in line with really powerful lands of the days of yore. Now you have to jump through some hoops to turn it on. Is it worth it to do so? We'll find out. I think in the older formats, in Commander, in Vintage, in Legacy, in Modern, I think you're going to see Tarnation Vista tap to make 3, 4, 5 mana pretty often. A lot of people think this is too hard to turn on. I don't think so. I think this land is really powerful. Potentially a little busted. And may end up becoming one of the most sought after cards of this entire set. I think it is that good. I don't know if it'll get there in Standard, but it'll get there somewhere. All right, so we have looked at the entire list now of the 30 cards from the big score. I wish that I could, look into the Wizards design files and see the other 20 cards that got cut. Because I think they designed it just like Aftermath, or really close to Aftermath, in terms of the number of rares and the number of total cards. I think they were going to do a 50 card epilogue set. I think they were going to do 5 card boosters. And I think they cut 20 things that were roughly like uncommons. Some of the less powerful, less interesting, call them more like filler cards of the set. They probably had a role to play in Standard. They were probably like fun or interesting cards. Maybe they were for other formats. But I think they chopped that down so as not to overwhelm this set with too many cards, to not have to make them show up in packs all the time. Otherwise, they'd be really hard to collect if there were like a full 50 of them and they were showing up at this rarity rate. Still, I'm curious what those cards were. What could have been. And now that we've seen all of this, are you all still of the opinion that it's a good thing that they did not make this set in an epilogue form with epilogue boosters? Just for a moment, let's pretend that they wouldn't have overcharged for it. I know that's a big assumption, but I want to take that point of contention out of the conversation. Let's say they priced the epilogue set at a reasonable price. So, somewhere between $2 and $3 a booster pack of epilogue boosters. So for a box with 24 of these little boosters in it, that'd be somewhere between $48 and $72, somewhere in that range. Do you all still think it's good that this set got canned, that it got chopped down 20 cards, and that it got shunted into this set in this slot? Do you think that is preferable to it being released in an epilogue form? Or do you have a different opinion? Do you believe it shouldn't have seen the light of day at all? Do you think these cards, you don't like them, that they never should have been printed, that they should have just been gone into the ether, burned and forgotten in a design file, lost forever? Do you like the current implementation? Do you feel like this is the best of all possible worlds with this particular implementation where they're showing up in about 1 out of every 5.5 play boosters? I'm really curious, because I, for one, feel like it would have been nice to get this in a little epilogue set. Get this plus the 20 other cards, whatever they were. I feel like they wouldn't have been as hard to get a hold of. All right, buying them in that form. Because I've seen from Aftermath that it's not too hard to get a hold of the Aftermath cards. You don't have to open that many boxes of it before you've got what you need. Some of the mythic rares are a little bit, harder to get in multiples, but if that product had come out at a reasonable price, do you think that would have been better? I feel like that would have been better, but maybe I'm in the minority here. Sound off in the comments and let me know. Anyway, I think this set is far more interesting than Aftermath. I feel like it's got a tighter design. It's got a mechanical theme that runs through it. I feel like the flavor is better. I feel like the cards are stronger, that they're less niche and build around, that they hang together with an identity a bit more. They feel more fun to me. I feel like this set would have succeeded where Aftermath failed. I feel like they're just not the same thing. And And even if they had the same number of cards, came out in the same booster size, had the same number of cards of different rarities, that the design of the sets was wildly different. Right? We're talking about like the difference between 2 multicolored cards and 23. It's just an enormous gulf between what these products were doing. So I guess I will let this be for a minute. I've covered this on the channel over and over again. I think it's time to let it rest for a moment until I get some of the cards either on Arena or in my hands. So please like and subscribe. Check out my other videos on the channel. Helps out a lot. And until next time, never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.